Minnesota Territory, winter 1873. The cold came before the light. Elias Croft knew this the way he knew the weight of his rifle, not as knowledge learned from books or from other men, but as something the body understands on its own, through years of repetition, through enough mornings standing in the dark, with frost in his beard, and breath rising white against a sky that had not yet decided to become day. He had been in the Minnesota Territory for 19 years. He had come as a young man with 2 horses, a pack of dry goods, and the particular kind of optimism that belongs only to men who have not yet been shown what winter truly means above the 45th parallel. The horses were long dead. The optimism had transformed into something else, not bitterness, not wisdom exactly, but a kind of steady attention, an understanding that the forest did not care about him, and that this indifference was the most honest relationship he had ever known. He stood outside the cabin door on the morning of the 2nd of December and looked north. The sky was the color of old pewter. The pines stood black against it, their tops barely moving in a wind too cold to feel like wind. It felt instead like the absence of warmth, like the air itself had given up on carrying temperature, and had become simply a medium through which cold moved without resistance. He could see perhaps 40 yards into the trees before the darkness swallowed everything. Somewhere deeper in, following the creek northwest for 3 miles, and then cutting up the ridge, his first trap waited. He had set the line 4 days ago, 12 traps spread over 9 miles of wilderness, following the drainage patterns where beaver moved and where marten came down from the high ground in search of mice under the snow. He had not checked them since 9 miles in, 9 miles out. 2 days of work, maybe 3 if the snow had drifted badly across the ridge. He had done it 100 times. He packed his kit the same way he always did, methodically, without rushing, the way a man packs when he respects what might go wrong. Dried meat wrapped in cloth, a tin of matches sealed with wax, his skinning knife and his spare knife, the Sharps rifle he had carried since 1861, its stock worn smooth where his hand gripped it, 40 rounds, a wool blanket, fire-starting material. He did not pack for comfort. He packed for continuation. Before he left, he stood in the doorway of the cabin and looked at the interior one final time. A single room, a bunk against the wall, a small iron stove, a shelf with 3 books whose covers had come loose from too much reading, a photograph nailed to the wall beside the stove, a woman and a child, the image pale with age, the edges curling slightly from the years of heat and cold. He did not look at it long. He pulled the door shut, checked that it latched against the wind, and walked north into the trees. The snow was 8 inches deep on the flat ground, deeper in the hollows. It was dry and fine, the kind of snow that squeaks under boots and drifts without much provocation, and it had been undisturbed enough that he could read it like a page of careful writing. He saw rabbit tracks first, the paired prints crossing and recrossing in patterns that suggested they had been moving since before the wind died in the night. Then, the 3-toed signature of a ruffed grouse, walking in a line so straight it seemed deliberate. Then the pushing, rolling track of a porcupine, moving toward a stand of young birch 50 yards off the trail. He read all of this without stopping, absorbing it as he walked, building in his mind the picture of what the night had been, who had moved, where they had gone, what they had been looking for. This was the skill that kept a trapper alive and productive, not the shooting or the campcraft or the knowledge of knots, but the reading, the ability to look at the ground and understand time, to see not just what was there, but what it meant. He did not see wolf tracks that first morning. He was not thinking about wolves. The creek was frozen solid by the first bend, the ice gray-green and opaque, pushed up in ridges where the current had fought the cold before losing sometime in mid-November. Elias walked beside it rather than on it. Old habit, old caution, the kind that becomes automatic after a man watches someone else go through ice and understands in a visceral and permanent way how quickly a situation changes. The creek bank was choked with tag alder, their stems gray and fine, dusted with snow, and he moved through them with the particular silence of a man who has learned that sound travels differently in cold air, farther and more clearly, carrying meaning to ears he could not see. The first trap was empty. He reset it, checked the pan, cleared the snow from the trigger mechanism, rebaited with a piece of dried beaver castor that he kept in a small tin in his coat pocket. The smell was sharp and rank, cutting through the cold air with a persistence that surprised him every time, year after year. He moved to the second trap. Empty also, but the snow around it had been disturbed, not by the intended quarry, but by something else. He crouched and looked at the disturbance for a long time. A large animal had circled the trap, approached within 2 feet, then withdrawn. The tracks were partially filled with blown snow, which meant they were at least 12 hours old, probably more. He read the size and the shape of the print, and set the information aside in his mind without attaching much significance to it. The second trap, on a small promontory above the creek, where Martin regularly traveled between a stand of old spruce and a beaver pond, held a fisher. A large one, nearly 12 pounds, its black fur still thick with the prime of early winter. He killed it quickly and cleanly, the way he did everything connected to this work, without ceremony, but also without carelessness, the way a man does something he has done many times and still takes seriously. He skinned it with practiced efficiency, rolled the pelt into his pack. The carcass he left on the snow. Something would find it before dark. Something always did by midday. He had checked 6 traps, 1 fisher, 1 marten, 4 empty. The sky had lightened slightly, that pewter gray becoming something almost white, though the sun itself remained invisible. Its light diffused across the entire overcast into a directionless brightness that flattened shadows and made the distances seem compressed, the way distances always seemed compressed in overcast winter light, as if the sky was pressing the world down. He ate sitting on a fallen log, his back against a spruce trunk, the rifle across his knees. Dried venison and a handful of parched corn. He chewed slowly and watched the trees. The forest was quiet, not the active quiet of a winter day when things were moving just beyond sight, but the particular hush that falls when small animals sense a predator and go still. He noted this while he ate and thought about what it meant. He had walked 9 miles of forest that morning and had seen nothing larger than the disturbed snow around that second trap. The ravens were absent. The chickadees that usually moved through the spruce in loose, chattering flocks were nowhere. He thought about this for a time, then stopped thinking about it, because thinking too hard about the absence of something was how a man frightened himself unnecessarily in the wilderness. And Elias Croft had learned long ago that fear, out here, spent energy he could not afford to waste. He packed up his food and moved on into the quiet forest. The ridge caught him in the early afternoon, the trail climbing steeply through a stand of old-growth white pine that had somehow escaped the logging that had taken most of the big timber from the lower ground. These trees were enormous, 4 feet across at the base, their lower branches 60 feet up, their crowns lost in the gray sky. The ground beneath them was almost clear of underbrush, the canopy too dense for much to grow, and the snow lay in shallow, uneven patches where it had filtered down through the branches. Walking was easier here, quieter. The sound of his boots changed on this ground, from the squeaking compression of dry open snow to something softer and more muffled. And in the deep silence beneath the pines, even this smaller sound seemed loud. He checked the 6 remaining traps on the ridgeline. 3 held animals, 2 marten, and a small beaver that had wandered up from a pond he hadn't known was there. He added the pelts to his pack and reset each trap carefully, taking his time, knowing that a badly set trap was a wasted effort, and that the difference between a good season and a poor one was made up of exactly these small margins of care and attention repeated enough times. He worked with the concentration of a craftsman, fingers nimble despite the cold. The work so familiar it required almost no conscious direction. As he worked the last trap on the ridge, he found the tracks. They were fresh, made within the last 2 hours, the edges of the prints still crisp and clean, the snow in the bottom undisturbed by wind or settling. He stood up slowly and looked at them without moving, without speaking. They came from the north, moving along the ridge just inside the tree line, following a line roughly parallel to his own trail, but offset by about 30 yards. He counted the sets of prints visible from where he stood. 4 animals, moving in single file, each placing its feet in nearly the same spots as the one ahead. The characteristic travel pattern of wolves covering ground efficiently, conserving energy by breaking trail for those behind. He followed the tracks with his eyes to where they disappeared around a curve in the ridge into thicker timber, where they were lost to distance and shadow. Then he looked back along his own trail. The line of his boot prints in the snow was the only disturbance on this side of the ridge, for as far as he could see. He looked at the wolf tracks again, the parallel lines, the consistent offset, the direction of travel, which matched his own exactly. They had been following him. He stood on the ridge with this information, letting it settle, letting it find its proper weight without adding to it unnecessarily. He knew wolves. He had lived alongside them for 19 winters. He knew what they were and what they were not, and he did not allow himself the kind of dramatic interpretation that lesser men in this country applied to everything they didn't immediately understand. He checked his rifle force of habit, the action smooth and automatic, and looked north into the trees where the tracks had come from. Nothing moved. The forest held its strange silence. He shouldered his pack and continued along the ridge toward his camp for the night. He made camp that first night in a hollow he had used before, a natural depression between two fallen pines that provided windbreak on two sides, deep enough that a fire would not throw its light far into the trees. He had used this camp 4 or 5 times over the years, always in late fall or early winter when the trap line brought him this far out. And he knew its characteristics the way he knew the inside of his own cabin. How long the wood he gathered would burn before needing tending. How the smoke rose in still air versus moving air. Where the cold settled in the hours before dawn. He built his fire carefully, not large, not showy. A working fire that gave heat and light enough to cook by without advertising its position across the darkness. He melted snow for water, boiled it with a handful of dried mushrooms, and a piece of the beaver carcass he had saved from the skinning, made a thin gray soup that he drank slowly from the tin cup while the fire settled into coals. The soup was poor, but hot, and hot was sufficient. The trees around the camp were dark walls beyond the firelight. The light reached perhaps 20 feet before it lost authority, and the darkness took over completely. And beyond that 20 feet, there was nothing he could see or hear above the small sounds of the fire itself, the tick of contracting wood, the faint whisper of coals shifting. The sky had cleared slightly toward evening, enough that he could see a few stars through gaps in the canopy, cold and brilliant. The kind of stars that only appeared when the temperature was well below 0, and the air had given up any pretense of moisture. But cloud cover was returning from the northwest, moving across the stars one cluster at a time, patient as everything in this country was patient. He thought about whether to set a trip line in the trees behind the camp, a simple cord strung between the trunks that would rattle and pull if something heavy came through. He thought about it for a time, turning the idea over with the same practical attention he gave to all equipment decisions, and ultimately decided against it. A trip line would tell him something was there after it was already close. He would rather trust his own ears, which were, after 19 years of this work, quite good. He lay down with his back to the fire, and the rifle beside him, the barrel pointing outward toward the trees. He pulled the wool blanket over him and closed his eyes. He did not sleep well, not because of the cold, which he was accustomed to, and not because of fear exactly, but because of the state that lives between alertness and sleep in a man who is alone in the wilderness and has reason to pay attention, a half-consciousness in which the mind keeps working even as the body rests, cataloging sounds, assessing intervals, testing the darkness with its full attention, even while the body attempts to find rest. He heard the wind pick up after midnight, moving through the tops of the pines with a steady rhythmic sound like breathing. He heard the creak of branches, expanding and contracting in the cold. Twice, he heard sounds that might have been footsteps in the snow, and both times he lay still and listened until the sound did not repeat, and he allowed himself to accept that it had been wind, or a settling branch, or the natural movement of the snowpack. Near dawn, he heard them howl, distant perhaps 2 miles, perhaps 3. A single wolf, the long notes rising and falling in the particular way that carried across cold air like no other sound in the natural world. Then others joining in, building the chorus, each voice distinct, the high and the low weaving together into something that was not quite music, but occupied the same territory, something that made demands on the listener that had nothing to do with pleasant experience. Elias had always found, in some part of himself, he had never quite articulated even to himself, that the howling of wolves was one of the most accurate sounds the wilderness made. Not threatening, not beautiful exactly. Honest, he lay still and listened until it stopped. Then he sat up and put wood on the coals and sat by the revived fire in the dark, waiting for morning to find him. Dawn on the second day came gray and reluctant, the light seeping in slowly from the east, finding no particular moment of arrival, but accumulating gradually until the trees became visible, and the snow took on its characteristic blue-gray tone of early morning. Elias had been sitting by the fire since the howling, drinking hot water with a pinch of salt, thinking through the day ahead with the methodical attention he applied to all decisions that had practical consequences. He had 4 more traps to check on the far side of the ridge, 2 miles further into the wilderness than yesterday. He had set them early in the season when the weather was still workable, and they were the most productive part of his line, a series of beaver ponds connected by a stream, surrounded by dense spruce thicket, the kind of habitat that held animals all winter long. He had been planning to check them today, and then begin the return journey. The wolves complicated this. He thought about the complications practically, without drama. A pack following a trapper was not unheard of. Wolves were opportunists, and a man moving through the forest was a disturbance that turned up prey animals startled from cover, animals struggling in traps, carcasses left behind after skinning. The pack had likely been following the smell of his bait and his kills since yesterday morning. This was the rational interpretation. He applied it and found that it held, or held well enough. He decided to check the remaining traps as planned. He broke camp efficiently, scattering the fire, covering the coals with snow, erasing what he could of his presence, and started north toward the beaver ponds. The wolf tracks were everywhere. They had circled the camp during the night. He could see this clearly now in the morning light, the ring of prints in the snow moving just outside the range of the firelight, a circuit that had been walked multiple times, the prints layering over each other in a way that made counting individual animals difficult. He circled the camp himself, reading the snow, moving slowly with his head down. 6 animals at minimum, possibly more where the tracks overlapped. They had come within 15 feet of where he had been sleeping. He stood in the center of the dead camp and turned slowly, looking out at the circuit of prints around him. 6 wolves had sat in the trees around his fire last night and watched him sleep. He held this thought for a long moment, not letting himself rush past it to the next practical consideration, giving it the weight it deserved. Then he picked up his rifle and walked north. He found the deer at the beaver pond, a young doe, not large, perhaps 90 pounds, dressed out, lying at the edge of the ice where the inlet kept a small opening of open water, the place where deer regularly came to drink. She had been killed there at the water's edge. The snow around her churned and stained dark. Killed cleanly, the throat opened and fed on heavily. The hindquarters largely consumed, the ribcage cracked and opened. But not finished. There was still considerable meat on the carcass, and in his experience, wolves finished what they killed when they had time and the safety of undisturbed territory. They had left this one. He crouched beside the carcass and read the snow around it with care. The pack had been here. He could see where they had fed, the drag marks, the deep churning of the snow around the site. And then they had gone south, moving as far as he could trace the tracks through the timber at the pond's edge in the direction of his camp. They had left a fresh kill and walked south toward the camp where he was sleeping. He stood with this information for a long time, looking at the carcass and at the tracks moving south. A nuthatch moved down the trunk of a nearby spruce in its characteristic head-down way, tapping industriously at the bark, indifferent to everything. The ordinary sounds of an ordinary winter morning in the spruce thicket continued around him without pause. He checked his remaining 4 traps, 2 marten, a small beaver, reset each one, and stood at the edge of the pond. He looked north, where the undisturbed forest continued its unbroken business. He looked south, where the pack had gone. He turned south. He told himself it was the reasonable decision. He had checked his traps. The day was advancing. Conditions were developing in a direction that warranted monitoring. He told himself this, and it was true, all of it. And also it was true that he did not want to spend another night in the spruce thicket with a pack of wolves circling his camp. And that this second truth was the one with more weight in his feet. He walked south, and the cold settled around him like a judgment. He had gone perhaps a mile when he saw the first wolf. It was on his left, in the trees, not close, maybe 60 yards, visible for only a moment as it moved between 2 stands of dense spruce. A large animal, dark gray, with markings on the back that he could not quite resolve at this distance, moving at an easy walk, not running, not retreating, simply moving, keeping pace with him. Inside the cover of the trees, he stopped, watched the place where it had disappeared into shadow. Nothing moved. Then on his right side, at approximately the same distance, another movement. He turned his head slowly, the way you moved your eyes and head when you did not want to startle something you were trying to see clearly. A second wolf, lighter in color, also moving at a walk through the trees parallel to the trail. It stopped when he stopped. It looked at him with the direct, assessing look that wolves had. Then it continued and disappeared behind a screen of spruce branches. He he stood on the trail with his rifle held across his body and did a careful survey of everything within his field of vision. The spruce thicket on both sides was close and dense, visibility limited to 60 or 70 yards at best in most directions. The trail ahead ran straight for perhaps 100 yards before bending to the right around a rise. Behind him, the trail was empty as far as he could see. He started walking. Not fast. He did not run. Running was the worst possible response, and he understood this with the certainty of deep knowledge. Not in the moment, but from the accumulation of 19 years in this country, from conversations with men who had faced similar situations, from the Ojibwe hunters in the early years who had taught him what the land actually held and how it actually worked, as opposed to what men from Ohio imagined it held. Running triggered the pursuit response in canines. Running told them what they were dealing with. Running made you prey in a way that walking did not. He walked at a steady pace, the rifle ready, and the wolves walked with him through the trees. By midday, he had seen 5 of them. Not all at once. They appeared and disappeared singly, and in pairs, always in the trees, always at roughly the same distance, never approaching and never retreating, never giving him a clear reason to raise the rifle. They were extraordinarily quiet for animals their size. He could sometimes hear them moving in the snow, a soft, compacting sound when they stepped in an unbroken patch. But often he heard nothing at all and knew they were present only because he caught movement at the periphery of his vision, or because the ravens told him. The ravens had joined the procession by mid-morning. 3 at first, then 4, moving through the canopy at treetop height, landing occasionally in the crowns of the tallest pines, looking down. Ravens followed wolves throughout the Minnesota winter. He knew this. Anyone who spent time in the wilderness knew this, because they had an ancient agreement built on mutual benefit. Wolves opened carcasses. Ravens fed on what remained. But ravens also moved toward commotion, toward the expectation of a meal, and their presence above this procession through the spruce carried a meaning. He did not choose to examine 2 directly, while he was still moving through the densest part of the thicket. He crossed the creek at a point where the ice had been pushed up into a thick ridge by the pressure of the current freezing from both ends. He moved across it quickly, but without running, purposeful. And when he reached the far bank, he turned and looked back. The wolves had not crossed. He could see 2 of them standing at the far bank in the open. The first time they had stood in the open where he could see them fully and clearly. He looked at them across 40 feet of ice and winter air. The one on the left was very large, perhaps 120 pounds, dark gray with that black saddle marking he had glimpsed earlier, standing with its head lowered slightly, and its eyes fixed on him with an attention that was not aggressive and was not neutral. The other was smaller, lighter colored, standing slightly behind the first. They looked at him with the focused patience of animals who were not hurrying because they did not need to hurry. He looked back at them and felt something arrive in him that he had not felt since his earliest years in this country. A specific kind of fear. Not the panic that stops function. Not the cold sweat of imagined catastrophe. the clarifying kind, the kind that strips away everything non-essential and presents a situation in its exact dimensions. He was being assessed by something that had been doing this since before the first man in this territory put a name to what it felt like to be assessed. He turned and walked south. He made 4 miles that afternoon before the light began to fail. The wolves stayed with him the entire distance. He had stopped trying to count their individual positions and had settled into a state of focused movement, keeping his pace steady, watching the trail ahead, conserving the energy that attention and fear spent with equal generosity. He did not fire his rifle. There had been no moment that justified it, no charge, no approach within the range that demanded response. Only the following, the patient, unhurried following. He thought about the deer carcass as he walked. A healthy pack with sufficient prey did not abandon kills. They had abandoned this one and moved toward his camp. He thought about what that meant and turned it over several times and did not find an interpretation that fully satisfied him. He chose his second camp on a low rise above the creek, the best defensive position available in this part of the forest. Open ground on 3 sides where he would have sight lines. The creek as a natural barrier on the 4th side. A single large white pine at his back, whose roots had pushed up the earth into a rough wall he could lean against. He gathered wood before the light was entirely gone, making 3 trips to the fallen timber at the creek's edge, piling far more than he thought he would need. He built the fire larger than he ever built it in ordinary circumstances. He did not make any apology to himself for this. He was a practical man who used the tools available to him, and fire was one of the oldest tools a man had in this situation, one that had been in use since before the first written account of wolves and men sharing darkness. He sat with his back against the pine root wall, the fire between him and the open ground, and he ate and drank and watched the darkness. He was very tired. He had covered more ground than planned, moving faster than his usual pace for most of the afternoon, and the deep ache of hard work in cold air had settled into his legs and shoulders. He did not sleep. He could not allow himself to sleep. He would tend the fire and wait for morning. At some point near midnight, his sense of time had loosened in the long, unbroken darkness. He saw the eyes, 2 points of reflected light at the edge of the firelight. Yellow, not warm yellow, not the orange yellow of firelight itself, but a colder color, a color that existed before the names of colors were established. They were at the height of a large animal's head. They were approximately 25 feet from where he sat. He did not move suddenly. He placed his hand on the rifle. It was already beside him, already ready, as it had been all night, and looked at the eyes without looking away. They looked back at him, unblinking, completely still. He added wood to the fire without lowering his gaze. The fire rose and its light pushed outward, and in the extended circle, he saw the wolf. It was the large, dark gray animal he had seen at the creek crossing. He was certain of this, the size, the black saddle marking visible in the orange light, the specific way it carried its head. It sat on its haunches 28 feet from him, regarding him with the expression that wolves had been using to regard humans since long before the first human was in a position to describe it. Patient, present, without urgency of any kind. "I see you," Elias said. His voice came out steady, which surprised him. He had not spoken in 2 days, not since leaving the cabin, and the sound of it was strange in this dark, as if it belonged somewhere else entirely, somewhere with walls and other voices, and the ordinary sounds of human life. The wolf looked at him. It did not stand. It did not come closer. After a time that he could not have measured with any accuracy, it turned its head to the right and looked into the darkness beyond the firelight. And in that darkness, looking steadily in his direction, were other eyes. 2 pairs, 3, all at the same height, all with the same yellow quality, all with the same particular attention. He sat with his back against the pine root wall, and his hand on the rifle and the fire between them. And he waited for morning to come and take this darkness apart piece by piece. In the long hours between midnight and dawn, he understood several things that the daylight hours and the constant business of moving had not given him space to understand. The first was that the pack was large. 6 animals minimum, possibly 8. He had seen 5 during the day, and at least 3 sets of eyes in the darkness, and he had no reason to think the visible animals were the complete count. A large pack meant an established hierarchy, a dominant pair who made decisions for the whole, animals who had hunted together through multiple winters and knew precisely what they were capable of and what they were not. Large packs were not erratic. They were deliberate. The second was that his original assessment, that they were following his hunting, opportunists drawn by the smell of his kills and his bait, was no longer sufficient to explain what he was observing. Opportunists did not maintain a pursuit over 12 hours of active travel. They did not circle a camp at 15-foot distance. They did not leave a fresh kill and follow a man. What he was seeing was something more deliberate than opportunism. He did not have a better word for it and did not manufacture one. He simply noted that the word opportunism was no longer doing the work he had assigned it. The third thing he understood was that he had perhaps 3 miles to cover to reach the open country south of the spruce thicket, and from there another 6 miles to the cabin. He could cover 9 miles today. He had done 12 yesterday with a full pack. He could cover 9 miles if he left at first light and maintained his pace. The fourth thing he understood was that the rifle was loaded, and he had 39 rounds remaining. This was more than sufficient for any encounter he could rationally construct. He thought about what sufficient meant while the fire burned and the yellow eyes watched from the darkness. And he found that the word had limits he had not previously examined. He left camp before full light, the sky still dark, but with a gray quality entering it from the east that was the announcement of light rather than light itself. He had not slept. His eyes felt dry and tight, and there was a faint unsteadiness in his legs that he categorized as fatigue rather than anything else, though he acknowledged to himself that the distinction was not always available for inspection. wolf by the fire had been gone when he stood to break camp. No eyes in the darkness. Nothing in the extended circle of a freshly fed fire. He heard nothing in the last 2 hours before dawn. He packed efficiently, scattered the fire, and moved south at a pace that was as fast as he could sustain without running. The first wolf appeared at the end of the first mile, left side. Then one on the right. Then he looked back along the trail and saw 2 more behind him, standing in the open, watching him move away. Not concealed, not even attempting concealment. They were closer than yesterday, not dramatically closer, but measurably. Yesterday, they had kept 60 to 70 yards in the trees. This morning, some of them were 45 yards, some 40. He noted the change without comment and continued south. He noted it the way he noted changes in weather or terrain, as information relevant to his decisions. Nothing more and nothing less than what it actually was. He thought about what continuing to close at this rate would mean by the end of the day, and he found the thought uncomfortable. And he stopped having the thought and concentrated on the ground under his feet, on the trail ahead, on placing each step on the compressed snow of his own previous tracks, where the going was easier and quieter. The spruce thicket ran for another 2 miles south. He knew this country. He had walked it 3 days ago, and he had noted then, with the background attention he gave to all practical features of terrain, that it was close and confined country, the kind of ground where visibility was limited and movement was constrained, and a large animal that moved on 4 legs was in every practical sense more capable than a large animal that moved on 2. He walked faster. The pack walked faster with him. He was tired. The fatigue was in his legs and in his shoulders where the pack sat, and it was in the particular way his thoughts moved, slightly slower than usual, arriving at conclusions with a small delay, the cognitive friction that comes from a night without sleep following a day of hard travel. He was aware of this and accounted for it. He adjusted his expectations of himself downward by a careful and specific amount, and did not allow himself to be surprised by what the adjustment revealed. A marten crossed the trail ahead of him, 20 feet out, pausing to look back over its shoulder with the bright, liquid intelligence of a small predator, then vanishing into the spruce with the efficiency of something that had been evading larger animals since it was old enough to understand what larger animals were. He watched it go. He thought about what a marten saw from its position. A large, slow, 2-legged animal moving through the snow with a group of wolves at its margins, and thought that the marten had made its assessment in under a second and had acted on it immediately. He envied it the simplicity. He reached the creek crossing at mid-morning. The same ice ridge he had used twice before on this trip. He moved across it the same way, quickly, with purpose. He reached the far bank and turned. The pack had crossed the creek. 4 of them visible on his side of the water. They had come across in 2 places, the heavy animals using the ice ridge directly, 2 others finding a shallower crossing upstream. They stood on his bank, 50 yards back, looking at him. He counted carefully, 4 visible. His running count of the pack was 6 at minimum. The other 2 were somewhere in the spruce on either side of the trail ahead, He turned his head slowly to check the trees. Nothing visible. The spruce was dense, and the light was still flat, and anything still would have been invisible at 30 yards. He knew they were there the same way he knew other things he could not directly verify, through inference, through the accumulated logic of what he had been observing for 2 days. He kept moving. He was 5 miles from open country. He intended to reach it before dark. He felt the moment change somewhere in the middle of the 2nd mile south of the creek. It was not a dramatic change. There was no single event that caused it. It was a shift in the quality of the following. Something in the way the pack was moving that was different from yesterday. A precision in how they positioned themselves relative to him, in how they responded when he changed pace or stopped. He stopped once and turned completely around, facing south on the trail, and watched them stop and redistribute, 2 on the left sliding further into the trees, 2 on the right adjusting, the ones behind holding position. And then, when he turned and resumed his direction, they all resumed theirs. He thought about this carefully. What he was seeing was not the behavior of animals following a man in hopes of a meal. What he was seeing was management. They were managing his movement, keeping him in the channel of the trail, limiting his options on the sides, maintaining pressure from behind. He said this to himself in exactly those words, standing on the trail in the gray December light. And then he sat with what those words meant. He had 5 miles to the open country. The light would begin to fail in 3.5 hours. He could cover 5 miles in 3.5 hours at his current pace, barely. He could cover it with certainty if he pushed harder. He would be more tired tonight. He would be in a significantly worse condition if he had to spend another night out. These were all true things. He also had 39 rounds, and a rifle he had used for 12 years and knew, in every particular. He made his decision. He would not stop before the open country. He would not make a third camp in the spruce thicket with the pack positioned as it was. He would push his pace regardless of the cost to his condition, because condition was recoverable and some other things were not. He walked hard into the afternoon, and the pack walked hard with him, managing his passage through their country with the terrible competence of animals who had been doing exactly this for a very long time. Elias Croft had been 26 years old when he came to the Minnesota Territory in 1854, out of Ohio, from a farm outside Dayton, where he had grown up working his father's land. He had left that farm on a morning in April because he could not make himself stay any longer in a place where everything he looked at reminded him of what he had lost. There had been a woman, Sarah, his wife, and a son of 4 years named James. He had loved them both with the complete and somewhat surprised love of a man who had not expected to find himself capable of such feeling. They had been building something together, the 3 of them, something ordinary and necessary and good. And the cholera had come through the county in the summer of 1853, the way fire comes through dry grass, fast and indiscriminate, not caring about what had been built or what was planned. Sarah had died in August. James had died in September, 10 days after his 4th birthday. Elias had survived. He was not sure, in the years following, whether surviving had been the better outcome. He had survived without resolution on that question and had kept moving, which was the only answer he had to offer. He thought about this now as he pushed through the darkening afternoon, the pack on his periphery, his legs burning with the sustained effort of hours of hard walking through deep snow. Thought about it not with fresh grief that had been worn to something smoother long ago, but with the old, quiet acknowledgement of a man who has carried something long enough that it has become structural. Weight he no longer noticed because it was distributed through everything he did. He had come to the territory because it was the farthest north and the most empty place he could reach with what he had. He had not wanted to die. That was important to note. Even now, even in these specific circumstances, what he had wanted was to be somewhere that bore no resemblance to what he had lost. Somewhere the trees were different, and the air smelled different, and nothing reminded him. Minnesota had given him that. He had been, in his particular and inarticulate way, grateful. He thought about this, and about the distance remaining, and about nothing in particular, walking hard through the gray afternoon with wolves on 3 sides, and the forest received all of it with its usual indifference, which was, he had always felt, a form of honesty he appreciated more than he had words for. The light began to fail faster than he had calculated. The cloud cover, which had been high and diffuse all day, thickened in the early afternoon, dropping lower, and by 2 o'clock the brightness that had sustained reasonable visibility was draining from the sky with something approaching urgency. He could feel snow coming, not yet, but close, the heavy stillness and the particular smell of air about to release its held moisture. He had 3 miles left to the open country. Failing light, 3 miles through dense spruce with a large pack running tight, was a fundamentally different thing from 3 miles in clear morning light. He thought about stopping. He thought about making camp in the best available position and building the largest fire he could and waiting out the night with his back to something solid and his rifle on his knees. He had enough wood. There was always sufficient deadfall in the Minnesota spruce. He was tired but functional. He had 39 rounds. He did not stop. Not because stopping was irrational. Stopping might, in certain calculations, have been the safer, immediate choice. He did not stop because of something that was not pride exactly, and not stubbornness exactly, and not fear exactly, but that drew on all 3, and was also something separate from all 3. He did not stop because he had covered ground in worse conditions, because the open country was 3 miles, and 3 miles was not very far, because to stop now would require him to sit still in the dark, and the cold, and the closeness, and trust something he was not sure he trusted anymore. He pushed into the thickening dark, and the wolves pushed with him. They were closer now. 25 yards, sometimes 20. He could hear them in the snow with regularity. The soft compression of their steps, no longer occasional, but continuous. A border of small sounds around him as he moved. He could see individual animals in the peripheral darkness, with increasing frequency, shapes moving between trees at a distance that 2 days ago would have been alarming. Now it was simply where they were. He fell once. His boot caught a buried root, and he went down hard on his left knee, the rifle swinging on its sling, and he was up immediately, before he had consciously decided to rise, before the pain had fully registered. His knee hurt with a sharp, specific quality. He noted it and walked. He heard the change in sound behind him first, not the small compression of a wolf walking. Something with more rhythm to it, a quickening, a sound that his nervous system registered before his mind had processed it. The way certain sounds bypass conscious thought entirely, because the response they call for is older than conscious thought. He turned. The large, dark gray wolf was 30 feet behind him on the trail, moving at a trot, not the lateral, cautious movement the pack had used all day. Down the middle of the trail, in the open, directly toward him. He turned fully and raised the rifle. The wolf stopped. It stopped at 20 feet and looked at him. Its head was carried low, at trail height, the posture of an animal focused entirely on what it was doing. Its eyes in the last flat light of the gray afternoon were yellow. The same yellow he had seen across the fire the night before. Patient, without urgency, utterly present. He had the rifle raised, and the wolf in his sights, and his finger resting on the trigger guard, not on the trigger, but adjacent to it, one small movement from contact. And he did not fire. He did not fire because of the understanding that arrived with sudden and complete clarity. If he fired and missed, or fired and wounded without killing, the situation would change in a way that could not be recovered. A wounded animal, a pack that had heard a shot, a man at a known position in dense cover with fading light. This was not a better situation. He was certain of this with the certainty that bypasses reason, because it comes from a place below reason. He held the rifle raised. He held the wolf's eyes with his own. He had been told, in his early years in the territory, by men who had spent their lives in this country, that there were things you did not look away from, that with wolves, who lived in a hierarchy built on the exchange of gaze, holding eye contact from a position of stillness was a statement. It told the animal something about what it was looking at. "No," he said. His voice came out low and steady in the darkening air. The wolf looked at him for a long moment, a moment that contained, Elias felt, a great deal of information moving in both directions. Then it stepped sideways off the trail and into the spruce on the right side and was gone. He lowered the rifle slowly. His hands were shaking. He noted this as information about his current physical condition, filed it, and turned south. The snow began to fall as he came out of the spruce thicket. He crossed the last stand of dense trees in near darkness. The sky fully overcast, the first flakes falling, large and wet, and reducing visibility further. And then the ground opened ahead of him, the trees falling back on both sides, and he was standing in the first of the open meadows that bordered the creek for the final miles to his cabin. The meadow was wide, perhaps 200 yards across. The snow was coming down with more purpose now, the flakes smaller and faster, a real winter snowfall, and the tree line on the far side was already going gray and soft in the falling white. He stopped at the meadow's edge and looked back. The tree line was 30 feet behind him. Dark. He could not see the wolves. He waited, standing in the falling snow with his breath rising and the rifle in his hands, and he watched the tree line, and nothing came out of it. He waited 5 minutes. 10. The snow built on his hat and shoulders. The meadow was still and white and empty. Nothing emerged from the trees. He turned and walked south across the meadow, the snow accumulating on him as he moved, and behind him, the forest held whatever it held in its own silence. He covered 2 miles across the meadows before the darkness became absolute and forced him to stop. He made a small camp in the lee of a single large cottonwood, built a fire with the dead lower branches, small, hot, burning clean, and lay down with the rifle and the darkness around him. His knee had stiffened from the fall, and it ached with a steady pulse when he put weight on it. He estimated 4 miles to the cabin. He did not hear wolves that night. Once, far to the north, he thought he heard the howling, long high notes in the darkness, but it was faint and could have been wind, and he did not know any more whether the uncertainty was in the sound or in himself. He lay in the snow under the cottonwood and stared at the fire and waited for the night to finish its business. He reached the cabin at mid-morning of the 4th day. The last 4 miles he walked in clear weather, the snowfall having stopped before dawn and left 6 fresh inches on the ground, and the sky had gone from gray to the pale, saturated blue of a winter morning after a storm. A blue he had noticed every year for 19 years, and had never found a satisfying way to describe. The sun was visible, low in the south, throwing long shadows across the snow, and the world had the quality it sometimes had in these conditions, scoured clean, every tree and stone in its exact place, the air so clear that detail at a distance was precise and sharp, and the eye could trust what it saw. He walked into the clearing in front of the cabin and stopped. He stood and looked at the building for a long time, the log walls dark with age, the frost on the small window glass, the thin thread of smoke still rising from the chimney where he had banked the fire 3 days ago. He had built this cabin in the fall of 1856. He had cut the logs and notched them himself, and set the roof with help from a Frenchman named Villeneuve, who had passed through that summer, and had known something about roof construction that Elias had not. Villeneuve had moved on the following spring, and Elias had not seen him since. The cabin had stood through 17 winters. It was not beautiful. It was his. He crossed the clearing and pushed the door open. The interior was cold, but not deeply cold. The banked coals had held some warmth through the 4 days. He dropped his pack by the door and sat down on the bunk and put the rifle against the wall and sat with his hands between his knees in the posture of a man who has arrived somewhere and is taking a moment to let his body understand the fact of arrival, the stove, the shelf with the 3 books, the photograph of Sarah and James on the wall beside the stove, everything exactly as he had left it. After a while, he stood and put wood in the stove and waited for the heat to come. He slept for 12 hours. Not the fractured half-sleep of the spruce thicket, but real sleep, weighted and complete. The kind that takes a man fully under and returns him slowly. And when he woke, the stove had burned down, and the cabin had grown cold again, and the light through the window was the flat gray of mid-afternoon. He lay on the bunk for a while and looked at the ceiling logs, tracing their grain the way he sometimes did when he was letting his mind come back to itself after time away. He made coffee from the small supply he kept for returns from the line, a luxury measured out carefully. The beans ground by hand in a small mill from Ohio. He sat with the coffee at the small table and looked at the photograph. Sarah was 23 when it was taken. Her expression was composed with the self-consciousness of someone posing for a camera in 1850, when being photographed was still a novel and serious event. James was 2 years old and was looking at something off to the left of the camera, something that had caught his attention in the moment, and his expression was one of pure, uncomplicated interest in whatever that thing was. Elias had always valued this about the photograph. James had not been posing. He had simply been himself. He sat with the coffee and the photograph and thought about the wolf's yellow eyes. He found, with some surprise, that the two images, the photograph and the eyes, did not feel unrelated to each other. He turned this over for a while and could not fully account for the connection his mind was making. And eventually, he stopped trying to account for it and simply allowed both things to be present at the same time, the way he allowed most things that did not resolve cleanly into explanation. Some things were simply there, and the effort to explain them was sometimes a lesser activity than the effort to sit with them. He drank the coffee. The stove ticked and creaked as it expanded with the heat. Outside, the wind moved through the tops of the pines. He spent 3 days at the cabin before going back out. The knee took most of the first 2 days to return to full function. He had bruised something in the fall, not broken it, but it was stiff and particular about weight, and he moved carefully, accommodating it, letting it tell him what it needed. He spent the time doing the work that 3 days away always left, splitting wood, checking the cabin for cold weather damage, tending to the pelts he had brought back, and stretching them on the board frames he had made for the purpose over the years. The fisher and the marten and the beaver, their pelts stretched and pinned, drying in the cold, dry air of the cabin interior. He was not a man who examined his own interior experience as a habitual practice. He had not been raised to it, and the territory had not encouraged it, and the years of solitude had moved him further from this habit rather than closer to it. He noted his states: tired, hungry, alert, cold, the way he noted weather, as information relevant to what needed to be done. He did not, as a rule, spend evenings sitting with an experience and asking what it meant, but on the third evening, with the pelts drying and the fire steady, and the wind moving against the cabin logs in long, even pulses, he found himself going back over the 3 days in the spruce thicket with a deliberate and careful attention. Not reconstructing the fear had served its function and was finished. Not manufacturing pride out of having come through, he had done what was necessary, neither more nor less. Something else. He was looking for the right category for what the 3 days had been, and the closest he came was something like respect. For the pack, for the precision and patience of what they had done over those 3 days, for the intelligence of it, visible and deliberate, 7 or 8 animals operating with a coordination that had taken his measure and responded to it appropriately. He acknowledged this to himself in the cabin firelight, sitting alone with the pelts drying around him. And then he went to bed. He went back out on the 6th day. He had 4 traps unchecked on the far side of the ridge, the 4 he had turned back from when the pack was between him and them. He had been thinking about them throughout the 3 days of rest. The season was advancing. Whatever had been in those traps had been there nearly a week. The animals were likely lost, but the traps themselves were valuable, and the area they covered was the most productive part of his line, and not going back for them felt like a concession to the spruce thicket that he was not prepared to make. He was not prepared to let 3 days change his relationship with the only piece of country he packed the same kit, checked the rifle, stood in the doorway, and looked north into the gray morning the same way he had looked north 6 days ago. The clearing was empty. The pines stood dark and still. His breath rose white in the cold air. He walked north. The first 2 miles were the same familiar miles, known trees, the trail he had made himself over many seasons, the creek frozen and silent under its ice. He checked the near-side traps, found 1 marten, reset the others. He climbed the ridge through the old-growth pine, crossed its crest, and descended into the spruce thicket on the other side. He found no wolf tracks in the first mile, no tracks in the second. The 4 far traps were empty. Whatever had been in them was gone, freed by its own efforts, or taken by the cold, or taken by something else in the days he had been away. He reset each one carefully, standing alone in the deep silence of the spruce thicket, with the cold pressing in from all sides, and the ravens absent from the canopy above, and the forest entirely, and genuinely quiet around him. He stood at the furthest point of his line and looked north into the undisturbed wilderness for a long time. Nothing moved. Nothing watched him. The forest was simply the forest, going about its business without reference to him. He turned south and walked home. Winter deepened through December and into January. The temperatures dropped to levels that cracked trees in the night like distant rifle shots, and frosted a man's eyelashes in the time it took to walk from the cabin door to the woodpile. Elias worked his line twice more in December, and 3 times in January when the weather permitted, covering the same 9 miles each time with the same systematic attention, checking and resetting, reading the snow. He did not see the pack again that winter. He saw wolf sign single animals, pairs, once a small group of 3 that had moved through the north of his territory in a single night and continued east. But the specific pack that had followed him through the spruce thicket did not appear on his line again. He thought about this sometimes, about where they had gone, about the logic of their absence, as clearly as he had thought about the logic of their presence. Animals moved for reasons that were entirely their own, that lived beyond the reach of any explanation he could construct. The forest was larger than his understanding of it, and always would be. He had known this since his first winter here, and had made his peace with it long ago. In January, he made his monthly trip to the trading post at the settlement, 12 miles southeast. A half-day journey on the trail he had cut himself over years of use. He traded his pelts, bought his supplies, exchanged the brief and practically focused conversation of two men in a trading post who had nothing in particular to report to each other, but who were, in their way, glad of the exchange. The trading post keeper, a man named Halst, asked how the line was running. Elias said it was running well enough. Halst nodded. That was the full transaction. He was not an unhappy man. He wanted to be precise about this in the private accounting he sometimes conducted during the long evenings by the stove. He was a man who had chosen the life he was living with enough awareness of the alternatives to understand it as a choice. He had made the choice after losing what he had lost, and the choice had served him. The territory had given him what he had come looking for, ground that owed him nothing, air that carried no memory, work that demanded his full attention and rewarded it honestly. He was not an unhappy man. He was a man who, sometimes, in the long, quiet evenings, sat very still and listened to the night, and felt something in the listening that had no clean name, but was not fear. Spring came late that year. It came not as a single event, but as a slow negotiation between the cold and the returning sun, giving a day of warmth and then taking it back, advancing the melt an inch and then retreating, until sometime in late April the cold finally lost authority and the snow began to change its meaning. The creek ice went out in early April, groaning and shifting, and then releasing all at once with a sound like a long exhalation, and the water ran dark and fast between its banks. The south-facing slopes lost their snow first, revealing the matted gray-brown grass beneath, then the flats, and last the north-facing ridge, where the old-growth pine held its shadow through most of April. And the snow lay in patches into May. He found the wolf in the middle of May. He was moving through the spruce thicket on a morning of soft, wet air, the ground spongy underfoot, the last snow gone 2 weeks past, the thicket filling with the sounds of birds returning from the south. He almost walked past it. It lay in the spruce on the east side of his trail, half concealed by the low, sweeping branches, and he saw it only because a raven lifted from its position nearby, and the motion drew his eye to what the raven had been attending to, was the large, dark gray wolf. He was certain of this with the certainty of recognition. The size, the black saddle marking visible in the spring light filtering through the spruce, the specific proportions he had memorized across 3 days of close and focused attention. It was dead, had been dead for some time, weeks, he estimated, looking at the condition of the carcass in the cold spring air. It had been old, He could see this clearly now in a way he had not been able to see it across the distances of December. The worn and yellowed teeth, the gray extensively distributed through the dark muzzle, the visible prominence of the ribs beneath the remaining fur. It had been a very old wolf, and it had died in the spruce thicket in the deep of winter, in its own territory, in its own place. He stood looking at it for a long time. He thought about the yellow eyes across the fire. He thought about the wolf on the trail in the fading light of the second afternoon, 20 feet away, looking at him directly, without aggression and without retreat, simply looking at him from the position it had chosen to occupy. He thought about his decision not to fire. He was not a sentimental man, and he did not construct stories around what he was looking at. What he was looking at was a dead wolf in the spruce thicket in May, and the fact of it was what it was. Everything in this country died. The animals and the trees, and eventually the men, all of them coming to this same stillness in their own time and in their own place. The manner of the dying was less significant than the fact of the living. He knew this. He had known it for a long time. He looked at the wolf for a long time anyway. He went back to the cabin that evening in the long spring light, the sun still above the tree line at 6 o'clock, the air warm enough that he had shed his coat before noon and carried it tied to his pack. The forest around him was alive in the exuberant way of spring in the North Country. Everything that had been compressed and dormant and waiting suddenly released at once. The birds returned and loud in the canopy, the insects emerging, the buds on the birch and aspen at the creek banks showing their first green. A green so new and pale it looked like the color of something just beginning rather than something resumed. He hung his pack and rifle inside the door and stood in the clearing for a while, looking at the sky. The clouds were high and moving fast from the west, and through the gaps between them, the blue was the deep May blue he had noticed every year for 19 years. It was the same blue he had never found a way to describe. He had stopped trying and had simply made a practice of standing in it for a few minutes each spring, which seemed like a better response to it than the struggle for words. He built a fire outside that evening, the first outdoor fire of the season. He sat beside it as the light faded slowly from the western sky, and the stars came out one by one with the patience of things that have been doing this for a very long time. And the forest settled into the particular silence of a spring night, warmer than winter silence, more provisional, threaded through with the sounds of things moving and establishing the terms of the new season. He sat and thought about the wolf, about what it was to be old in this country, and to continue moving through it anyway, to carry the weight of what you knew about this ground and about yourself through another winter, and then another, to keep covering the same miles because the miles were what you had, and the covering of them was what you were. He thought about the difference between a man and a wolf, and found that it was many things, and also, in some conditions, cold conditions, dark conditions, conditions that reduced everything to its essential terms. Not as many things as he would have said before December. He thought about Sarah and James. He thought about the photograph and the way James had been looking at something to the left of the camera with pure, uncomplicated interest, entirely himself. He was 45 years old. He had been in the territory for 19 years. He had his trap line and his cabin, and his knowledge of this particular piece of ground accumulated winter by winter. And he had the spring coming on around him, and he had the fire. The fire burned down to coals, orange and steady, and radiating their warmth into the cool spring air. The stars completed another arc. Somewhere to the north, deep in the spruce country, something howled once, a single long note, high and clean, crossing the distance between wherever it was, and where he sat with the ease that wolves had always had with distance, arriving changed by the miles, but not diminished by them. He listened until it stopped. Then he sat a while longer in the silence it left behind. Then he went inside. Thank you for watching to the end. I really appreciate it. Bye-bye, my friends.